Though there's arguably never been a better time to play video games, given the utterly mind-boggling amount of choice on offer right now, it's also fair to say that the industry is going through some tricky times as we speak. And with that comes a number of home truths which we, as players, would prefer not to admit to ourselves because either they're inconvenient to do so or because it's just a massive bummer. But hey, that's what I'm here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 gaming facts that nobody wants to admit. Number 10. Valve are to blame for loot boxes. Now, though Valve are relatively unproblematic as video game megacorporations go, they certainly shoulder a good portion of the blame for helping normalise loot boxes in gaming culture through Team Fortress 2. While hardly the first game to implement loot boxes, Team Fortress 2 was one of the most popular and successful early titles to do so, with players able to speed up the process of unlocking digital goods by paying for the pleasure, as opposed to actually grinding for it. And this began all the way back in September 2010, and as the popularity of loot boxes surged in the years that followed, it's little surprise that the rest of the gaming industry took notice. As for Valve themselves, they raked in over $1 billion in revenue last year from Counter-Strike 2 loot boxes alone. The inclusion of loot boxes may not be bad in all games, but it has nevertheless become the most blatantly cynical way for publishers to create another revenue stream for their products, and Valve, well, they are hugely complicit in that ongoing culture. Number 9. The Ubisoft formula is popular for a reason. There are few AAA publishers more popular to dunk on than Ubisoft, who are constantly criticised for their formulaic nature of their open-world games, ranging from Assassin's Creed to Far Cry, Watch Dogs, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, and most recently, Star Wars Outlaws. The so-called Ubisoft formula is defined by open-world maps which are populated with tedious busy work tasks, endless collectathons, and a lot of things to do, but not a lot of things actually worth doing. And yet, for as much as the gaming press loves to rib Ubisoft for how bland they perceive this template to be, general players have made it clear time and time again that they can't get enough of it. There's a reason that most of the aforementioned games are hot sellers. Your casual gamer who is maybe playing only a few AAA games per year and yet encompasses a massive slice of the gaming market actively enjoys the unchallenging familiarity of these open worlds. It's like fast food. It's a dependable-ish product for your money, even if it's hardly artistry of the highest order. Much as gamers with more refined palates might decry how characterless the Ubisoft formula is, it works for the overwhelming majority of people who actually play games. Number 8. You are never going to finish your backlog. And that's okay. Now, there isn't a gamer among us who doesn't have a colossal backlog. With the sheer number of great games releasing every month, the absurd sales on Steam, and the Epic Games Store straight up giving away games every week, it's basically impossible not to have a giant stack of titles waiting to be played at every moment. And while we all tell ourselves that we'll start chipping away at our backlog one day, perhaps when we're retired, you can save yourself a ton of self-inflicted anxiety by admitting that you're just never going to get there. And you know what? That is okay. There simply isn't enough time in the rest of most people's lives for them to finish every game they own, especially if you factor in a desire to do things that aren't gaming. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you're not breaking the bank and not stressing yourself out, that is fine. Being at peace with the idea that you've got all these games waiting to be played and you may or may not get around to them is actually a truly liberating feeling. Don't make gaming feel like a job by trying to trim down your backlog at every given moment. You play what you want to play, and that's it. No harm, no foul. I take this from a guy who literally does gaming for his job. I don't play as many games as probably you think I do. I choose them, I carefully research which ones I want to play, and then I dive in. And that's it. I've made my choice. I'm done. Sometimes I make bad choices with them though. Number 7. The current console generation has been mediocre. It's totally mind-blowing that we are almost 4 years into the current console generation already, presumably over halfway to the next PlayStation and Xbox consoles being in our hands. And yet, much as it pains anyone who splashed out top dollar for a shiny new console, hasn't this generation been thunderously underwhelming so far? And now, to be clear, there have been obviously fantastic games released on the PS5 and Xbox Series X, but in terms of titles that broke new ground and fully justified this new hardware, well, that's a tough argument. Even the most technically polished releases have largely just looked like glossier, smoother versions of the prior gen. There just hasn't been that tectonic leap that we all hope to see by the time we reach a generation's midpoint. An undeniable part of the problem is that some AAA games are still being released on PS4 and Xbox One. I'm looking at you, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which doesn't remotely help the association that the current gen is just a small technical hop upwards rather than the expected leap. The indie and PC scenes have been crushing it, no question, but if you splashed out on a console for truly stunning, transformative gaming experiences, well, they've been shockingly lacking this generation so far. It's not nice to say, but it is true. Number 6, we care way too much about review scores. While review scores can, of course, be useful as a barometer to gauge a game's perceived quality and whether or not it's worth paying top dollar for, the average review discussion thread on social media almost immediately devolves into groan-worthy nitpicking over the aggregated number. People lost their minds when Starfield got an 83 on Metacritic, a rock-solid score, albeit one that quite rightly indicated the game was very, very far from perfect. And yet, to some who just couldn't face the prospect of it scoring less than 90, it indicated that the game was a disaster. Similarly, look at a game like Death Stranding, which raised some eyebrows with its 82 Metascore, a much lower figure than most of Hideo Kojima's other games. Yet it's a title that's still embedded in the gaming discourse 5 years later. Nobody's saying that you should buy a game with a 50 or lower Metascore day one, but there's something to be said for solidly entertaining meat and potato games that get a 65 or 70. They're not reinventing the wheel, and they might be a bit messy, but they're fun. I mean, Scott Telford and I have been banging on about this for ages, and we actually felt kind of justified when Nakey Jakey actually put out a video on 7 out of 10 games. We were like, yes, this is exactly what we've been saying. Sometimes a game cannot be perfect, but still be perfectly enjoyable. And yeah, as I said before, we all have limited time to game, but if you only lock yourself into playing the so-called best games according to an aggregator, you're going to miss out on some real gems that just might vibe with you way more. Number 5, video game storytelling is mostly still inferior. We've thankfully come a long way from the notion that video game storytelling is bad. We simply wouldn't have TV adaptations of The Last of Us and Fallout if mainstream game narratives were still predominantly shallow messes. But it's also worth facing up to the truth. Much as we all want video games to be seen as a mature medium, most games are still lagging behind in storytelling that is available in movies, TV, and books. Now, there are certainly exceptions, especially with some of the uncompromising, impeccably written games in the indie space, but in the AAA sphere in particular, the biggest games tend to fall short when stood next to the most prominent works in other art forms. And it makes sense, given that gaming is a much newer medium than any of the above. It's still maturing comparatively, and as the years pass, we're likely to see the complexity and the nuance of its narratives only increase. Of course, it is worth noting that video games have one major advantage over all of these other disciplines. They're interactive, and great gameplay can often comfortably paper over pretty sloppy writing. Number 4, our obsession with graphics is hurting the industry. Now, there's no denying that the games industry is in a rough place right now. Layoffs are at an all-time high, and the average development time of a new AAA game just keeps getting longer. The latter is in large part due to gamers tirelessly demanding eye-wateringly cutting-edge graphics if they're going to throw down £60 or £70 for a new release. And even accepting that the current gen has felt rather underwhelming from a technical perspective, it's still clear that publishers often spend over 5 years pouring enormous time and money into producing games as mind-bogglingly polished and photoreal as possible. Yet perhaps it's time for gamers as a whole to take a step back and appreciate how this endless thirst for state-of-the-art visuals is only placing studios in ever more dire straits, because when they spend as long as a decade making a game, it has to be a mega hit, or it just might kill them off overnight. And this is without even getting into the more problematic issues like crunch. But what can be done? Well, more of an emphasis on distinctive and arresting art styles rather than laboured over photorealism is probably a good start. As I always say, great art direction is better than great graphics. Number 3, gamers won't vote with their wallets. Now, it's a general rule of thumb as a consumer to vote with your wallet. Nothing will ever be more potent than your purchasing power, and so you can make a pretty grand statement by just not supporting practices you disagree with. But the simple truth is that microtransactions, FOMO mechanics, early access nonsense, and half-finished games would actually go away if players en masse had the self-control to wait for reviews and to punish publishers for shady practices. Now, of course, you should buy whatever you want to buy, and nobody's going to judge you for that. But at the same time, if you lament how aggressively the industry is pursuing additional monetization of games that you've already dropped 70 quid on, then maybe don't buy a game that enacts those business models. Historically, time and time again, gamers have complained about things, but not actually followed through by leaving their money in their wallets, because you've just gotta play that new Star Wars game regardless, right? Number 2, you don't really own your own games. Though there are many who continue to fly the flag for physical games media in the name of ownership and preservation, it's time to face facts. You almost never really own your own games anymore. Obviously, the argument against digital games speaks for itself. You're reliant on platforms like Steam continuing to exist in perpetuity, and even then, you really own a license to play the game rather than the game itself. If the publisher decides to pull the title for one of many reasons, well, you're out of luck, mate. And even with physical games, so many titles released today, especially in the AAA sphere, require frequent or even permanent online connections that mean that the game disc is basically just a means of access to digital content. Important though it is that gamers continue to fight for preservation and try to enact legislation to ensure that digital games can be permanently accessed in any scenario, it's also worth making peace with the fact that just about any new game you buy isn't something you genuinely own. Pandora's box is open and unfortunately cannot be closed here. And number 1, franchises can't always be for you. And finally, perhaps the biggest unspoken, heartbreaking truth of being a gamer is that the franchises that you once loved with every fibre of your being won't necessarily always be to your taste. Take the mainline Final Fantasy games, which have increasingly alienated die-hard fans in the last few entries by shifting away from more traditional RPG mechanics towards something more streamlined, culminating in the wildly casual-friendly Final Fantasy XVI. And while you can lament what the series used to be and be angry at what Square Enix has done to it, it's simply part of the franchise's evolutionary process, as it figures out what it wants to be for a whole new generation of players. Now, this can certainly be disappointing to long-time fans, but as the years pass, it's unlikely that every franchise you love will maintain a direction that you also love. These things tend to happen in cycles. Maybe you'll drift away from it for a while and then return to it at a later date once it tries something else that you vibe more with, or maybe not at all. To expect a franchise to be specifically dialed into your exact preferences and nobody else's forever, that is pretty unrealistic, my friend.